Star Wars Episode VII. This is a movie that I never thought I would see. This is a movie that for years sounded more like a myth than a tangible thing. A post-Jedi movie that existed in some ethereal form in every 12-year-old's imagination for decades. I remember growing up and having debates with my friends about the expanded universe and what a sequel trilogy would possibly be about. Would we see Mara Jade? Would Luke turn to the dark side? Essentially, the universe was a playground for our imaginations to run wild. And while George Lucas always insisted that there would be an eventual sequel trilogy as well as his prequel trilogy, it never seemed like it would actually happen. Throughout the filming of the prequel trilogy, George Lucas seemed to become increasingly defensive and protective of the Star Wars property. He insisted on directing each of the prequel films himself, and when asked in 2005 whether he would let another director take the helm and make an Episode 7, he flat out refused.
There is no Episode 7.
I remember people saying at the time that, well, when George passes away and gives up the rights to Star Wars, we'll be able to create our own Star Wars films, the way that we always wanted. Well, in October of 2012, Lucas finally did sell the rights to Star Wars to Disney, and immediately a new trilogy was announced. However, in doing so, Disney also announced that they would be doing away with the entire expanded universe. All the novels, comics, games that had made the universe seem so vast and limitless were suddenly disposed of in an instant.
I feel something terrible has happened.
I was actually surprised that more people weren't upset about this. In retrospect, the prequel trilogy didn't even do this, and instead used the expanded universe to craft the prequel trilogy. After all, the name Palpatine was only used in the expanded universe until The Phantom Menace. Same with the planet Coruscant, which was first mentioned in Timothy Zahn's 1991 novel Heir to the Empire. However, from Disney's perspective, I can understand the desire to come up with something new, both from an artistic or creative standpoint as well as a business one. If they had simply made a trilogy based on the Thrawn storyline or even the Yuuzhan Vong War, I think there would have been less excitement, mainly because if anyone wanted to find out what was going to happen next in the trilogy, they could simply just pick up one of those novels. As I've said before, Star Wars has always been best when it's a playground, full of possibilities, rather than being hamstrung by a particular storyline that it's obligated to adhere to. So with all that said, and all those open possibilities and worlds to explore, how did The Force Awakens deliver? Well, it was pretty disappointing, to say the least. Heartbreaking even. I remember walking out of the theater in a daze, shocked at what I'd seen. Before getting into the problems, though, I should say up front that there are some things that I enjoyed, particularly the characters, and even the actors. Daisy Ridley as Rey and John Boyega as Finn are excellent. And I even enjoyed Poe, played by Oscar Isaac. And it was great to see Harrison Ford being charismatic and fun again. I feel like I haven't seen him properly in a movie in almost 2 decades. And he's great in this movie. But with all that out of the way, there's a lot of problems, particularly around the storyline. Part 1. The story. A problem with structure. Now, I think it goes without saying that the biggest problem with The Force Awakens is its story, or really the lack of one. Every person who talks about this movie will say the same thing to you, that it was really too similar to A New Hope, the original film. But that assessment doesn't really strike at the root of the problem here. Because if the film really was about a planet-destroying superweapon and our hero's journey to stop it, I probably would have enjoyed the film. The issue is that The Force Awakens basically just lifts the basic plot beats of the original film, places them in the exact same order, and expects it to work, seemingly without realizing that The Force Awakens has a completely different dramatic question. Now let me explain. Basically every story ever told is divided into a 3-act structure. Now I'm sure this isn't new information to any of you, but let's break down these 3 acts and see what they mean, and more importantly, how this relates to Star Wars. Well, the first act exists to set everything up. Well, you can open your film with a bit of action to get the ball rolling. The first beat of the film generally is one that sets the tone for what normal looks like for our protagonist. They're poor, working on a moisture farm, they're working a boring job, they teach at a university, they're a nerd. The next beat is the inciting incident. Something happens to disturb their normal world, which is followed by the call to action. They're tasked with setting out and confronting this new challenge. Usually there's something called the refusal of the call, where our hero momentarily decides not to seek out this adventure.
Alderaan? I'm not going to Alderaan. I've got to get home. It's late. I'm in port as it is.
But then, one more event occurs that sets them over the edge, and they accept the call to action.
I want to come with you to Alderaan.
It's here that the first act ends with something called the dramatic question. This is the central narrative question of the film, and that will eventually be answered in the climax at the end of the 3rd act. For Star Wars, it was, will Luke get the Death Star plans to the Rebel Alliance and help destroy the Death Star? For The Matrix, is Neo the one? Will Indiana Jones retrieve the Ark of the Covenant? Will Spider-Man defeat the Green Goblin? Etc. The second act puts our heroes through a series of rising action and increasing challenges until we find ourselves in the final act, where in the climax the dramatic question is finally answered and our hero can come to a greater understanding about themselves and the world around them. Now with all that said, who can tell me what the dramatic question is in The Force Awakens? That's right, it's will Rey find Luke Skywalker? This is what the movie is about, and even before we get to the end of the first act, the movie's opening text scroll even spells it out for you, just as the opening text scroll of A New Hope explained that its dramatic question would revolve around the plans to the Death Star and the rebellion's plan to destroy it. A New Hope also has a subplot, which is Luke learning to use the Force. Subplots are usually smaller in scale and more personal to a specific character, but both should ultimately be resolved in the film's climax. Star Wars A New Hope does this masterfully. After 2 hours of Luke learning from Obi-Wan, rescuing a princess, escaping the Death Star, Luke finds himself in an X-Wing, attempting to destroy the Death Star. Just as Luke is about to take his final shot at destroying the Death Star, he hears Obi-Wan calling to him, and decides to put his faith in the Force, and in doing so, destroys the Death Star and frees the galaxy. In The Force Awakens, we also have a subplot. It's Rey trying to find her family. The dramatic question being to find Luke Skywalker and bring order to the galaxy.
Apparently he has a map that leads to Luke Skywalker, and everyone's after it.
Luke Skywalker? I thought he was a myth.
Yet the climax of the movie, strangely, is watching Poe Dameron, a character who has been missing for half the movie, blow up the Death Star, Starkiller Base, while Rey fights Kylo Ren over something. I don't understand this at all. The Starkiller Base isn't even introduced until an hour and 35 minutes into the movie. How is this the climax of the film? Imagine if in Raiders of the Lost Ark, Indiana Jones decided that he didn't want to find the Ark anymore, and instead found a way to blow up Germany and kill all the Nazis before, in the closing shot, Indiana Jones just walks up to the Ark, completely unopposed. I mean, technically it would have a big explosive ending and solve the problem, but it isn't exactly the conclusion to the story that we were expecting. What's worse is that finding Luke at the end of The Force Awakens is completely pointless. The reason they were looking for Luke in the first place was so that he could make things right.
This will begin to make things right.
But it seems like Poe Dameron already made things right by blowing up the First Order's base. They're all gone now, so why do we need Luke? If you ask me, the climax of the film should have been Rey and Kylo both figuring out the final pieces to Luke's map, and both arriving on the planet to find Luke. Kylo to finally kill him and the last of the Jedi, and Rey to convince him to return to protect the galaxy. If we wanted to tie in Rey's subplot, we could even have her discover her parentage. Either Luke reveals that she's his daughter, or that she's Obi-Wan's daughter, as well as to explain why she was abandoned on Jakku. But then, just before Rey can process this, Kylo appears, and Luke is either killed or immobilized, and Rey realizes she has to be the one to take charge and defend the galaxy. She finally steps up and accepts her greater destiny and fights off Kylo Ren, using not only the Force, but perhaps a sly maneuver taught to her by Han Solo earlier in the film.
Yes, I bet you have.
To me, this would have been 100 times more satisfying. But that's assuming that we're working under this specific premise, because I'd probably change a lot about that as well. Which brings us to Part 2, the premise, Luke running away. So we've already talked about the idea that finding Luke is the dramatic question of the film. In fact, it's in the opening title crawl. But of course, the question instantly becomes, why did Luke run away in the first place? But hey, it's the opening title crawl. Surely they'll explain this throughout the course of the film. But they don't. Just like everything else in the film, they insist that you don't worry about it, and that they'll come up with a sensible explanation in the next movie or two. But let's think about this for 1 second. If you had asked me to describe Luke Skywalker to someone who had never seen Star Wars before, the one thing I could say Luke would never do would be abandon his friends, or give up on a family member who has turned to the dark side. It's basically the core principle of his character. Remember when Luke gave up on his Jedi training to save Han and Leia, even though both Yoda and Obi-Wan told him not to? Or how about when Luke gave himself up to Darth Vader and the Emperor, because he felt his father could be redeemed, even though everyone told him it was impossible? Obi-Wan, his father's longtime friend and mentor, tells him that he's more machine than man. Even Darth Vader himself tells Luke that there is no conflict.
There is no conflict.
And yet apparently, 30 years later, Luke feels that Kylo Ren is somehow unredeemable. Kylo Ren is conflicted in literally every scene he's in. And yet apparently Luke was so devastated that he fled the Republic without telling his sister or longtime friend Han Solo where he was going. And also, the parents of the student who just turned to the dark side? I mean, I can understand if you're using this premise as a shock for the audience, as if a character we know intimately has suddenly done something so out of character that we're drawn in to find out why this has happened. But if that's the case, then you have to deliver on that promise. Explain why this character has made this decision. But of course the movie never does this, and instead just adds this to the list of questions it feels like it doesn't need to answer, and that we're expected to come back to the theater in 2 years to see if the writers could find a way out of the hole they've dug themselves into. Fuck you. I mean, this just doesn't make sense to me. Luke went up against the Emperor, and Kylo Ren is too intimidating for him? The guy almost got his ass kicked by a stormtrooper, and a girl who had never held a lightsaber before. But even more confusing than all of that is the map that Luke left so that someone could find him, even though he's in hiding. Part 3. The map. That is not really a map. No, the entire plot revolves around a map to Luke Skywalker. In the first scene of the movie, Max von Sydow gives Poe the map, telling him that this will make things right.
This will begin to make things right.
A promise that the movie quickly disproves, I assure you. So there's a map to Luke Skywalker, and the Resistance wants it to bring him back into the fold and defeat the First Order. Well, the First Order wants this map to find Luke and kill him. Okay, well, fair enough, but where did this map come from? I thought Luke had run away. Apparently what had happened is that Luke decided to run away, but before he did so, he made a map to where he was going to go, hid part of it inside R2-D2, then took part of the map with him to the planet that he was going to, and then after an unspecified period of time, he gave that part of the map to Max von Sydow to give to the Resistance, even though the part of the map with the exact location of the planet he was going to was in R2-D2 all along, making the rest of the map kind of pointless. What's also confusing is that they say Luke is in uncharted space, or something like that.
It matches no charted system on record.
I mean, the only other time I remember there being maps in Star Wars was in Episode 2, when Obi-Wan was trying to find Kamino, but it wasn't showing up in the star map. In this scene, it seemed like they had the galaxy pretty well charted out, and this was 60 years ago. Han even says 30 years later that he's flown from one side of the galaxy to the other. And then at the end of Empire, it looks like they're on the outside of the galaxy looking in. Yet somehow in this movie, there's parts of the galaxy that are unmapped or unknown? How is that possible? Wasn't there a republic of planets for 1,000 generations? Some 25,000 years? And there's still unmapped sections of the galaxy? Well, okay. But you're telling me that you can't find what part of the galaxy this is by looking at this large cluster of stars? Surely any onboard navigational computer could figure out where this is, even if a portion of the map was missing. But really, why this whole thing is so frustrating is that none of the characters in the film really use the map as a map. The map functions in the plot the same way that the Death Star plans did, in that they're in a droid and they need to get back to the rebellion. But why? It's a map. Why don't you just use the map to find Luke Skywalker yourself? Especially when they team up with Han and Chewie, Luke's oldest friends. You'd think they'd be keen to find Luke again and get some answers about Han's son. I mean, according to the opening title crawl, Poe's mission was to find Luke Skywalker, not to find part of a map to where he might be. I mean, even if the map is incomplete, why aren't Han and Chewie at least following the map as far as they can and see if they can pick up Luke's trail? But no. Instead, Han takes them to a bar on a planet that's right next to the Resistance homeworld? Seriously, 20 minutes later it gets blown up, and it's visible from the planet they're on. Why didn't Han just take them to the Resistance in the first place? Anyway, they go inside for a drink or something and talk to Maz Kanata, also that Rey can find Luke's lightsaber. Why? What does Luke's lightsaber have to do with anything? Then Rey is captured and the only mention of the map again is that Kylo tries to get it out of Rey's mind, but can't, so then he leaves. I thought you guys were trying to find Luke. Oh, wait, no. This is a movie about blowing up a Death Star now for some reason. I mean, think about any other adventure movie you've ever seen. Indiana Jones, The Mummy, Treasure Island, Pirates of the Caribbean, National Treasure. The list goes on and on. Our heroes always start off with an incomplete version of a map. They typically have a set of clues that lead them from one place to the next to find more clues, and they follow this like a breadcrumb trail throughout the film. The villains are always on their heels. Maybe they swap the map back and forth a couple times. There's a double cross or two, maybe a twist, but ultimately the final showdown is at the location of the treasure, in this case Luke. Now, I know I've already talked about this nonsensical climax of The Force Awakens, but it bears repeating. What this movie was begging for was for our heroes and villains to be on a journey to discover the location of Luke Skywalker. This might have even helped explain why there was a map in the first place. Perhaps Luke had intended for the map to fall into the First Order's hands, and had laid out a breadcrumb trail in an attempt to set a trap for them. But when Rey enters the mix, it throws his plans into disarray, which results in Kylo getting the upper hand. Thus, Rey would have to step up and save the day for herself, while in turn rescuing Luke Skywalker. You know, an ending that would feel earned? Instead, Rey just shows up on the Resistance planet at the end of the film, and R2-D2 turns on and gives her the exact location of Luke. Wow, how exciting. What was the point of the map throughout all this exactly? You know, generally, right before the climax of a story like this, our hero, or protagonist, goes through something called a low point. This is the moment in the film where it feels like all hope is lost, and that the villain might truly prevail. Our hero has to power through, putting all of their strength towards doing one final thing before they're defeated. But in The Force Awakens, Rey just shows up and things work out for her. Even though just 13 minutes earlier, C-3PO assures us that there's no way R2-D2 could have the rest of the map.
It is very doubtful that R2 would have the rest of the map in his backup data. I am afraid not. R2-D2 has been in low power mode ever since Master Luke went away.
No, that wouldn't make any sense at all. That we wouldn't have thought to ask R2 for the map. You know, the droid right there, who's been Luke's most faithful companion, the one sitting right there the whole time, without being turned on, the last one to see Luke. No, much too obvious a location. Oh wait, he had it the whole time. Rey isn't even the one to discover this, or to do any work on the part of finding the rest of the map. It's just sort of presented to her because she showed up. Now I'm guessing that this is a rather obvious homage to R2 playing Obi-Wan Kenobi the entire Princess Leia transmission at the beginning of A New Hope, but as a conclusion to a film that's entirely based on finding the rest of this map, it's extremely anticlimactic, and quite frankly ludicrous. To just have R2-D2 turn on of his own volition and solve all the problems? All for what? A possible hint at Rey's parentage? Part 4, Rey's parentage. A twist without a twist. Yeah, we've got to talk about this now. Now, this to me is yet another example of lazy, incoherent writing. At the beginning of the film, Rey is an orphan on a desert planet who works as a scavenger. Her upbringing is obviously very similar to Luke Skywalker's, and we all know what happened to him, right? The most famous twist of all time.
I am your father.
But you see, what made that work is that we were given the context that Darth Vader couldn't be Luke Skywalker's father because Obi-Wan told Luke, and the audience, that Vader had been the one to kill Luke's father. Well, this turns out to be incomplete information. We don't realize it at the time. It's classic misdirection. We're told Luke had a father, but now he's dead, which is why he lives on a moisture farm on Tatooine. We aren't told to be constantly on the lookout for who Rey's parents possibly could be. In The Force Awakens, Rey flat out tells us that there's going to be a reveal. BB tells her that where he comes from is classified, and then Rey basically looks right at the camera and tells the audience, yeah, me too.
Classified, really? Me too. Big secret.
You see, a twist doesn't work if we're expecting it, especially when there's only one of two ways it could go down. Oh, Rey is the daughter of Obi-Wan? Wow, Rey is the daughter of Snoke, or Hux, or Phasma, or some yet unnamed Imperial officer who crash-landed on Jakku during this battle that seems to have taken place after Return of the Jedi? But guess what? We've seen that already. And Star Wars doesn't take place in a world where your bloodline is tied to some sort of monarchical succession, so it really doesn't matter who her parents are. Let's compare The Force Awakens with Game of Thrones for a minute. In Game of Thrones, we're also told about a reveal up front, Jon Snow. We're actually given a lot of information about this right off the bat, but it takes a while before all the clues fit together. We're told Jon is a bastard born to Ned Stark during the first year of Robert's rebellion, after Ned went to rescue his sister Lyanna from the Targaryens. No one knows who the mother is, and Ned never tells anyone. But at the same time, we're told, and shown, over and over again, how Ned's honor is the most important thing to him. Ned Stark fathering a bastard seems completely out of character, but because we're given the context that this is what happened, we don't really question it, and instead keep hoping that we'll find out about Jon's mother. Of course, eventually we get more information until we finally discover that Jon is actually not the son of Ned, but the daughter of Lyanna, who Ned had promised to keep secret because his father was Rhaegar Targaryen. Now this is important because it makes Jon Snow a successor to the Iron Throne, and Ned not being able to tell anyone about who Jon's true parents were makes sense too. Robert had just defeated the Targaryens on the Trident and was moving to take King's Landing. Ned later discovers that Robert had ordered the deaths of all the remaining Targaryen children, so keeping Lyanna's secret meant keeping her son alive. This is masterfully done, and what's more impressive is that we're given the clues to all this information up front, but we don't realize it. Jon being a Targaryen means something. It adds narrative weight to the story in a way that Rey being a Kenobi or a Skywalker just wouldn't at this point. What's more is the fact that we're constantly being hinted that Rey might be Han's daughter or Luke's daughter just makes the movie even more confusing. Does Han know who her parents are but just isn't telling her? Why? When Leia hugs Rey at the end of the film, is Rey hugging her mother? Her aunt? Just some stranger? I don't know what I'm supposed to be feeling right now. But if she is Luke's daughter, then why did he abandon her on a deserted planet for 15 years? This clearly took place before Kylo Ren burnt down Luke's temple or whatever, so it's not like Luke was keeping her safe from him because this wouldn't have happened yet. Nothing is properly explained ever, which brings us to Part 5, A Million Unanswerable Questions. As I think I've stated a few times now, The Force Awakens seems to actively avoid explaining anything that's happening on screen.
Where'd you get that?
A good question. For another time.
And if you know anything about J.J. Abrams, this perhaps isn't a huge surprise. If you've watched his TED Talk on the Magic Box, or if you've watched his show Lost, you'll quickly understand that for JJ, creating a mystery for his audience is his go-to storytelling device. So much so that it really doesn't matter if there is an explanation to the mystery, just as long as there is a mystery.
Guys, where are we?
As Abrams explains in this TED Talk from 2015, if there's an unopened box, you instinctively want to know what's inside, because the box represents possibility. It could be anything.
A boat's a boat, but the mystery box could be anything. It could even be a boat! You know how much we've wanted one of those?
Then let's just...
We'll take the box.
It gets people talking around the water cooler every week. It gets people invested. This is why so much of The Force Awakens is vague and poorly explained. JJ wants you to be asking questions, desperately wanting to uncover these mysteries.
I got to know.
But here's the thing. For this to work, there have to be answers. But I can guarantee you that J.J. Abrams has no idea who Rey's parents are. He doesn't know why Luke split his map into 2 pieces and why R2 didn't tell the rebellion where it was. He doesn't know how Poe survived, he doesn't know who Snoke is, and quite frankly, he doesn't care. All he cares about is that you're asking these questions and desperate to find out. Because ultimately, it won't be him who has to come up with the solutions to the problems he's created. It's a giant narrative scam designed to keep you coming back for more, all in the hopes that you'll uncover some hidden truth that was never actually there to begin with. The box was empty, and the man who sold it to you has run off to do another project where he'll pull the same stunt again. There was a time when people who were exposed as hucksters were run out of town on a rail, but thus far this hasn't happened for Abrams, so why would he stop grifting us? This is exactly what happened with Lost. For 6 years, Abrams, David Lindelof, and Carlton Cuse promised us answers to the biggest questions on the island. What do the numbers mean? What are the mysterious voices in the woods? What is the sickness? What are the rules? What was the real purpose of the Dharma Initiative? What's going on with the Man in Black and Jacob? I mean, I could go on and on. The point is that none of these questions were ever answered, and the only conclusion the show gave us is that these characters eventually died and got a somewhat happy reunion in some sort of purgatory. The jig was up. It wasn't as if Lost was suddenly canceled and the writers weren't able to deliver on the promises that they had intended. They knew at the end of season 3 that there would only be 3 more seasons to wrap up the show, but instead they continued to promise us answers to a show that never had any to begin with. I suspect the same will be true for The Force Awakens. Abrams gets to walk away, and ultimately the blame will get put on Rian Johnson or Colin Trevorrow for not delivering on the promises that The Force Awakens sets up. But ultimately, they're given an incoherent mess to try to dig themselves out of. Now, the same is true for the intervening years between Return of the Jedi and now. The film seems deathly afraid to give us any sort of explanation as to how we got to where we are at the beginning of The Force Awakens. None of it really makes much sense. Obviously, the rebellion defeated the Empire at the end of Jedi, and the Republic became a democracy again. But then if the Republic is in charge, then why is there also a resistance? How are they different than, say, the Republic Army? Or are they the same thing? Is the First Order just a remnant of the Empire? How have they not been wiped out in the 30 years in between? We even see a planet that looks like Coruscant get blown up at one point, but we're not told what this means. Is the Republic now gone? Is that important? I just don't understand what's happening. And this is a problem. Without context to what we're watching, we're instead scratching our heads, asking questions about logic and motivation the entire film because we're never given a solid foundation to build on. And these aren't intriguing questions. They're questions of confusion. The reasons for this, I suspect, are probably due to the audience reacting poorly to the politics in the prequels. Disney probably said, well, we can't have this new movie be boring, so we won't bother having any exposition on the current state of the galaxy or any of the underlying political mechanics. Yet, if you look to the original film, these scenes were actually quite prevalent. They gave us context and weight to the world the story took place in. When Alderaan is destroyed, I knew that was important. When this planet was destroyed in The Force Awakens, I didn't know what was going on. And lastly, what's really missing from this movie are stakes. At the end of The Force Awakens, the Resistance all meet up to discuss how they're going to destroy the Starkiller base, after just learning about its existence minutes earlier. Han says, there's always a way to blow it up.
How do we blow it up? There's always a way to do that.
Oh good. For a minute I was worried this might be a problem. So, Poe Dameron, a character who's been all but absent for the entire runtime of the film, flies in and blows up the base. But who cares? We're given every reason to believe that every First Order character survived the destruction. What difference would it make if Poe didn't blow up the base? All it did was blow up a planet that I'm not familiar with, home to a bunch of people I've never seen before or given any reason to care about. Part 7, a 3-part story. Now the biggest excuse I hear when I bring this up to people is, well, it's the first of a trilogy, so they don't have to explain everything up front. I don't think I've ever heard this excuse used on any movie ever before. This isn't a TV pilot, it's a feature film. No other movie I can think of leaves the audience without answering its own dramatic question, or even the most basic character arcs, while expecting you to return for its sequels. The only films I can even think to compare these to would be the Lord of the Rings movies. They were a series of 3 films that had a continuing storyline that didn't get resolved for 3 films, yet even in those, each individual film had its own dramatic question and conclusion. The Fellowship of the Ring all centers on whether the Fellowship of Nine can come together to get the ring to Mordor. The climax of that film answers that question by showing us the Fellowship being dissolved after Boromir ultimately gives into his lust for power and the ring. The Two Towers is even more clear-cut, with Frodo and Sam's storyline revolving around the redemption of Gollum, Aragorn and company defending Helm's Deep, and Merry and Pippin with the Ents. All of these storylines climax at the same time, with Sam giving one of the most emotional speeches I can remember. And of course, Return of the King concludes the entire storyline of Mount Doom. The difference being is that The Lord of the Rings didn't set up a never-ending slew of mysteries for us to come back to. We came back because we were given a solid framework in the first film that we wanted to see expand in the sequels. And ultimately, we knew for certain that there would be a conclusion and a coherent storyline to follow because the series had already been a series of books since 1937. With this new sequel trilogy, each individual film is being written by a different screenwriter, and only after the preceding film has gone into production. Episode 7 gives us neither a solid narrative foundation to build on, nor a series through line to follow. While we knew the ultimate goal of the Rings trilogy was to destroy the One Ring, I really couldn't tell you what the ultimate goal or point of this new sequel trilogy is. I mean, I guess it's to destroy the First Order, but why? And how? Not to mention, we've already seen this. Part 9, in conclusion. I feel like anyone who's grown up on Star Wars probably had their own idea of what a sequel to Return of the Jedi should be about, what characters should return, and where the story should go. Like I've said, Star Wars is a playground, but out of all the possibilities, I have to think the last thing the fan community wanted was a remake to the original film disguised as a sequel, and a poorly told one at that. With all of his talk about the possibilities of the mystery box, J.J. Abrams seems to forget about the endless possibilities that he could actually tell within a cohesive narrative. The Star Wars universe is vast and exciting, yet we're given a story we've already seen before. Our heroes and villains have new names and a new coat of paint, but it's all cosmetic changes to a series that should have expanded and evolved. I think what's ultimately lacking here is creativity. This is what made us love Star Wars in the first place. It's a place where anything could happen, with robots and aliens from 1,000 worlds and adventure around every corner. The Force Awakens is ultimately just a product to consume, with a second helping already in the works, when the series used to mean so much more.
Star Wars, you got the droids, they meet the mysterious woman. Who's that? We don't know. Mystery box, you know. Then you meet Luke Skywalker, he gets the droid, you see the holographic image, you learn, oh, it's a message, you know, she wants to, you know, find Obi-Wan Kenobi, he's her only hope. But who the hell is Obi-Wan Kenobi? Mystery box. So then you go and he meets Ben Kenobi Kenobi's uncle is Obi-Wan Kenobi, holy shit, you know. So it keeps it... Have you guys not seen that? It's huge.